I had a friend who was a priest, and one day he got a call from someplace far away, and they said, you know what, we're going to ask you to be provincial of your order. And he turned to me and he said, you know, Chris, I am now descending into leadership. Father Gene Geinzer, he's now in Beijing, great guy. It's SJ. We're now going to witness some of Peter Roskam's ascent from leadership. He was in leadership, I think very much displaying the confidence of his fellow members in the Republican caucus. But, you know, politics is a game where nothing is always for sure. And Peter has been promoted in the committee business to chairman of a key subcommittee on the grande dame of all congressional committees, House Ways and Means. It's really the ballpark where the most important games are played. And to see Peter, as I'm sure many of us have, on the evening news and on the weekend shows, talking about his latest investigation and putting questions to folks at that subcommittee is a big inspiration, I think, for Republicans, not just who have known him a long time in DuPage County and in the state of Illinois and Springfield, where he made such an impact, but I know to Republicans across the country, from Maine to California. That's why it's so great that all of us now can give him a big, warm City Club of Chicago welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman and Chairman Peter Roskam.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. And Paul, I was watching you during the national anthem, and you were having discussions with yourself. And you need to get back on your medicine, brother, because your face was animated, let me just say, at inappropriate times. That's all. I'm just going to leave it there. So yeah, you got, well, my brother's here, and he brought a bunch of doctor friends, and they're happy to interact with you, but that facial expression was what we call a desperate cry for help. So, now, reclaiming my time, thank you very much. Thanks so much for the invitation. I want to tell you a quick story, and it's a story that is connected with what Chris mentioned, and I've got this responsibility chairing the Oversight Subcommittee of the Ways and Means Committee. I want to tell you a story about a husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Sowers. True story, real people. They're dairy farmers in Maryland, and they've been doing this for about 40 years, and when you meet them, you look at them and you go, of course you're dairy farmers in Maryland. They have a look about them, and they look like they've been working in agriculture and so forth. And they got into the farmer's market business. And you know how this works, where you're selling over the weekend and so forth, and it's a little bit of a cash operation. So Mr. and Mrs. Sowers end up with some cash. Regular cash that needs to get deposited in their local bank. So they go into their local bank, and the teller said, hey, look, when you come in and you bring in over $10,000 in cash, it's a big hassle. Would you mind bringing in, less amounts of money? Bring in under 10,000. If you bring in over 10, we got to write a report, and it's a big hassle. Mr. and Mrs. Sowers, nicest people ever, said, sure, yeah, no problem. We'll come in with less money. That's a felony. The felony is structuring. That is, intentionally avoiding a federal reporting requirement, because you understand the underlying nature of this. They're going after, Mr. White in Breaking Bad, or they're going after, a human trafficking operation, or they're going after a mafia front group. And so this is a tool to try and drive reporting so that federal law enforcement can get their teeth into something. But the problem is, it doesn't work when there's no underlying bad act. So here's what happened. Mr. and Mrs. Sowers go in, they try and do banking one particular day, and lo and behold, their bank account has been frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. No notice, no phone call, No knock on the door from a federal agent. They are stuck in their situation, and these people feel like they're in a Franz Kafka novel. They can't figure out what's going on. What did we do? And they can't get to the answer. They can't get to the answer. The Internal Revenue Service has had a pattern of pursuing these types of cases. And I could give you chapter and verse about similar situations. We had Mr. and Mrs. Sowers in with 2 other witnesses a couple of months ago before our subcommittee. But before we put Mr. and Mrs. Sowers in front of the subcommittee, we had the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, who sort of gave us these answers about what they're doing. And at the end of the discussion, I said, now, Mr. Commissioner, in a couple of minutes, we're going to have Mr. and Mrs. Sowers and these 2 other witnesses. You know what their testimony is going to be on behalf of the Internal Revenue Service. Would you like to apologize to them today? And he said, well, I don't know what their stories are. I said, no. You know what their stories are. You know what you did to them. And on behalf of the Internal Revenue Service, would you like to apologize today? Again, his second answer was complete non-answer, avoidance behavior, nothing sort of answer. Third time was a charm. Mr. Commissioner, the Internal Revenue Service reached out and figuratively grabbed these people by the throat, choked them till they nearly died. On behalf of the Internal Revenue Service, you'd like to apologize to them, wouldn't you, today? And he said, I'm really sorry that this ever happened. Now, a commissioner's apology and $4 will get you a cup of coffee. I know that. But my point is that there is a disposition, and I would argue an attitude of impunity that has developed at the Internal Revenue Service that we all need to push back on against very, very hard. Now, there's a phrase that we will conflate many times, and it's a phrase that we will discuss, and it almost becomes a bumper sticker in campaigns, and the phrase is waste, fraud, and abuse. Right? You hear about this all the time. Waste, fraud, and abuse. Waste, fraud, and abuse. When I took on this responsibility, I began to think about these things differently. Waste is different than fraud, which is different than abuse. Waste is this. Waste is the ease with which you spend other people's money. Right? It's human nature. It is easier for one person to spend another person's money. It's who we are. It's deeply ingrained into who we are, and it comes with ease. We know what waste is. It's leaving the lights on. It's spending too much money for paper. It's doing all these sorts of things. It's just wasting money, and we know what that looks like. Fraud is a little bit different than that, I would argue. There is an intentional element to fraud. Fraud oftentimes is a manipulation for some sort of personal gain in many cases. And I'm going to come back to an example of fraud. But abuse is different altogether. Abuse is insidious. Abuse is corrosive. And abuse cannot and should not be defended. So the abuse that we saw in terms of the targeting based on political philosophy that the Internal Revenue Service did, any smart person across the political spectrum, regardless of your political philosophy, you are quick to recognize we all get to decide who it is that participates in the public square. We all decide who gets to have the predominant argument because we are persuaded by predominant arguments. We don't let a bureaucrat in a gray building someplace decide who gets to enter the public square based on their own agenda. And when we encounter that, we need to recognize it, and we all need to come together and push back hard on it. Now, this abuse side I've seen manifest itself in a couple of ways. And the one way really chilled me. Warren Wolfson's here today. Warren was my trial advocacy coach when I was a student at Kent, along with his bride, Loretta, who was my partner, not my coach. Warren, in his office, had that famous saying by the Lutheran pastor, the guy who said, first they came for this group, and I wasn't in that group. It wasn't Bonhoeffer, but it's in that era. And it's a poignant expression of what it means to stand up when you see abuse. This is in the Nazi era. So there was an interrogatory that I saw that the Internal Revenue Service sent out to this little pro-life group in Iowa. Little pro-life group wants to do their pro-life stuff in Iowa. And they apply to the Internal Revenue Service. And the big Internal Revenue Service starts hammering them with these interrogatories and these questions. And one of the questions took me back to Warren Wolfson's chambers. Because you know what the question said? It said, tell us about your activities. And they give a list of activities. And one of the activities was, we do prayer meetings. And you know what the Internal Revenue Service said? Tell us about your prayer meetings. Now, the hair on the back of my neck, I've told this story a dozen times. The hair on the back of my neck stands up every time I tell it because I am scandalized by that. The notion that a federal bureaucrat is jerking somebody around, telling them what is it that you're praying to and what's the nature of your prayers, that is completely out of control, and it cannot be defended. The Internal Revenue Service a few years ago sent letters to major donors who were making contributions to 501c4 and 501c5 organizations, that is, tax-exempt organizations. The Internal Revenue Service comes up with a letter, and they send it out to donors, and they say, we think you may have triggered a gift tax liability, and that your gift to the nonprofit group is a taxable event. Huge chilling effect all the way through. Unless you think that only conservatives are concerned about this, forget about it. I sponsored successfully. We got it through without a single voice in opposition out of the House. Every member of Congress within the past couple of months voted in favor of this, that said the Internal Revenue Service has no authority under the law to question these types of things. And I was able to put together, and we were able to join all the conservative groups that you would think of, along with the American Civil Liberties Union and the Human Rights Campaign, to say, hey, we're for Roskam's bill because we don't want the Internal Revenue Service messing with our donors. You see what I'm talking about? You see how it is that we need to push back and to recognize this and to call it out and to call it to carpet and to highlight it. And if we do that, then we can change a culture of impunity that is developed at the Internal Revenue Service. Now, it is not in anybody's interest, I would argue, to have the Internal Revenue Service in just kind of a completely marginalized heap in the corner at the end of this Congress. That's not my goal, and I don't think it's any thinking person's goal. And the reason is, we have a 99% compliance rate in this country about paying taxes. Americans, by and large, pay taxes voluntarily. It's a remarkable thing. I mean, it is really remarkable. But that level of confidence in the tax collecting system begins to erode if people think, hey, these guys are corrupt. They're actually manipulating. They're not just calling balls and strikes. They're not just calling, going after the taxes that are due. They're working an agenda here. And if that happens, we end up in a very bad place. So my hope is, and my expectation is, that what you're going to see coming out of this subcommittee and the Ways and Means Committee generally is this idea of holding to account institutions that need to be held to account, and to restore a level of trust and confidence so that the Internal Revenue Service is just collecting their taxes. They're like my 4th grade teacher, Miss Lillian Anderson. Tough, but fair. Don't jerk around with the woman, and life is going to be fine. But if you're talking when she's talking, it doesn't end well for you. You know what I'm saying? All right, I want to get back to this middle concept. We talked about waste, we talked about abuse, and I want to focus in on fraud, because there's a real opportunity for us to be performing at a much higher level. And now what you're thinking is, fraud. Hey, we're from Chicagoland. We're all too familiar with this concept. But the numbers in terms of the federal government simply take your breath away. So let me give you an example of an experience that I had. When I first got to Congress a few years ago, I rented a basement apartment. They called it a garden apartment, but it's a basement apartment. And I go in, I'd commute back and forth every week, and I go in, And I go into the basement apartment, and I'm walking in, and, it's carpet on the ground, and it's like, oh, man, this is really wet. It's really spongy, and it was totally soaked with water. It had been flooded. I called my landlord, super nice guy, tell him what's going on. He's like, what in the world happened? It hasn't been raining. What's going on? He went, oh, I know. His teenage daughter had been helping around the house, and she had been gardening. And she apparently got a phone call and got distracted and put the hose down and took the call but didn't turn the thing off. So all weekend long, it kept going and going and going and going, so that it was part of my welcoming committee when I came in there that evening when I came in. All right, so stick with that image of a faucet on and nobody looking. And now I want to take you to our Medicare system. Medicare has an old payment model. And it's one of these things you would never design this on purpose. And there's a zillion reasons, parentheses, excuses, as to why it exists today. But the payment model is called pay and chase. Now I'm going to simplify this for the point of explaining, but I'm not over-characterizing. Do you follow me? So pay and chase says this: if you pay a bill out, or you get an invoice, you pay the bill, and you chase it down later to determine whether it's fraudulent or not. Okay, nobody lives this way. There is no clear-thinking person that gets a bill and says, I'm going to pay it, and then I'm going to figure out later whether I owe the money or not. Ridiculous. Who does this? The federal government does. Medicare does this, pay and chase. Now, we bring in the head of fraud for Medicare, and we've got him in one of these hearings. And we ask, tell us about fraudulent or erroneous payments that are paid out by Medicare. What's your number? He says our number is 12.7%. Think about that. 12.7% of Medicare payments are fraudulent or erroneous. That translates into $1 billion a week, every week, out the door. Think about my basement. Think about what this looks like. Nobody's watching. Pay and chase, $1 billion a week. Think about that when you're driving down the Eisenhower or the Kennedy or someplace where you're jumping into a pothole that's as big as your car. Think about that when you're hearing about all these other pressure points in the federal government where the claim is there's not enough money to deal with this. Think about $1 billion a week going out the door. And this is not one of these questions where you've got to say, I heard Roskam say it's $1 billion a week. Surely there's another side of the story. There's no other side to the story. This is General Accounting Office numbers. This is Medicare numbers. Now, just for the sake of fun, I invited in the head of fraud for Visa, the credit card people. And we had him testify right after the Medicare person. He comes in, we just ask him a couple of questions. What's your fraud rate? He said, well, Congressman, on $10 trillion worth of worldwide transactions, 10 trillion with a T as in Tom, our fraud rate is 0.06%. Now, the phrase sense of wonder comes to mind for me. How is it even possible that fraud at that Visa element is 0.06% and the federal government is 0.06 compared to 12.7? How is this cavern possible? It's possible because of human nature. Why? Because it's easier to spend other people's money. Visa is spending their own money. Medicare is spending somebody else's money. And I know I'm making this point like grotesquely simple, and I know that there's more to it than that, and I know that there's many shades in this whole thing, but my point is we've got to do better than this. And I think that we actually can. So the good news is there were some remedies. We were able to work through some of these changes on a bipartisan basis. President Obama recently signed into law some of these changes that we were able to put on his desk. He agreed. So my point is, look, when the money is dry, and it is, and it's getting drier, then we need to figure out how to move forward. Let me give you one other insight, and then Chris, with your permission, let's open it up for a discussion. One other insight on this trade question that is so front and center right now for our country. So the United States, as we know, has historically been a world leader in trade. And it is absolutely incumbent upon us to continue to lead. So the Trade Promotion Authority bill is being considered by Congress. In a nutshell, what it does is it gives the President of the United States the authority to go and negotiate a trade deal. And there's two of these that are pending, one with Europe and one with Asia. And you want to give the President the authority to go and put together the best trade deal he possibly can. And then the President is held to account. He comes back, and that trade deal is voted on up or down. This makes all the sense in the world. The foreign nations are simply not going to put their best deal on the table until they know the President has real authority. If you're a foreign prime minister, you're not going to put your best deal on the table and then try and have it come back and it gets nickel and dimed and amended to death in Congress. You want an up or down vote on this. It makes all the sense in the world. Now, the problem is there's this weird confluence right now in Washington, and it's very, very strange. You've got some Republicans who are free trade Republicans that just don't have any confidence in President Obama. And so they don't want to vote in favor of this. You've got some Democrats that will give the President President Obama the benefit of the doubt on any other issue except this one. And so here's where I think we've got to do some sorting out as a country. One is we've got to get out of this notion, this sort of zero-sum game notion from an economic point of view. That is, we all benefit when the economy grows. Let's figure out how to make it grow and make it grow together. And if we do that, we get out of the zero-sum game that says the only reason that you're successful is at my expense. That historically has not been who we are as Americans. Part of our charm as Americans is we're happy when other people succeed. That's part of our charm, actually. And we need to make sure that we're doing everything to celebrate that and to make that more vibrant and dynamic and to reclaim that and to defend it. There's another thing that's going on, and I think that Chicagoland in general can be a big part of this discussion, and that is this. There is a restlessness right now about what the role of the United States should be from Americans. There's a restlessness, and there's a sense of ambiguity about it. And again, there's a weird dynamic that's very, very unusual. You've got some voices on the left, not every voice by any stretch of the imagination, but some voices on the left say this. They say, you know, the United States is not a force for good in the world. That's their argument. And that the world is better off if the U.S. steps back and does less, and that things will be better. You've got some voices on the right that don't necessarily believe that, but they say, look, we're broke. We're $17 trillion in debt. And it's futile. Our days of being able to assert ourselves are over, and we're not capable of doing it. So therefore, since it's expensive and it's not very effective, we should step back. So you see, for different reasons, the net effect is the same. And the net effect is a temptation to pull back from that and to have the U.S. do less and lead less. Now, I reject the straw man argument that says, well, this always means then boots on the ground and so forth. Nonsense. That's not what it means. But what it does mean is a sense of clarity about who the United States is and what our responsibility is in the world. And I fundamentally, personally reject both of those ideas. I think the United States is a force for good. Like, fantastic. And that when we show up, by and large, good things happen. And I think it's actually more expensive to recede from this leadership role than to play this leadership role. We've got to sort this out. And this 2016 campaign for the White House is going to be very, very significant. And as these candidates come to the fore, I have a prediction, and my prediction is that 2016 is going to be more of a foreign policy discussion than we've had since, let's say, the 1980 election. So with that, Chris, I'm happy to take any questions that are easy and make me look good.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. All right, guys, this part of the program relies on you. We've got questions. We want to write them down. While those are coming in, Peter, let me ask you one, and maybe this will preempt a question, but what the heck? What is the deal with Lois Lerner's emails, and how did she get away with this? Oh.
Lois Lerner, let me tell you a quick Lois Lerner story. I can do this in about 60 seconds, but it's important just how significant this is. Remember, Al Salvi ran for the U.S. Senate in 1996, and he loaned himself, I think, $1 million to his campaign, and he did it the right way. The Federal Election Commission said, you did it the wrong way, and they placed him under investigation in the fall of that election. And, you know, we'll leave it to the political scientists to tell us whether that's helpful or it hurts you. But my general experience is, you know, if you're under investigation and you've got World War II headlines in the Tribune, you know, it doesn't help you obviously get votes. So he loses the election, maybe for other reasons he lost the election, but he lost the election. Federal Election Commission comes back after him though, and they said, we make a settlement demand of you, and don't hold my feet to the fire. I think it was about $300,000. Al said, I didn't do anything wrong, and I'm not gonna pay you. They sue him in federal court. Federal judge reviews the pleadings, grants Salvi's motion for summary judgment. There is no case here against Al Salvi. Federal Election Commission, you lose. Not to be outdone, the Federal Election Commission comes back to Al and says, we're going to lower our settlement demand in light of the judge's ruling. No joke. And Al's like, this is ridiculous. Let me get on the phone with somebody who's got authority on the case. Person with authority on the case gets on the phone and says, we will drop our settlement demand if you pledge never to run for office again. Al said, put that in writing. And she said, we don't put that in writing and we never lose. And that was Lois Lerner. Now, take that attitude and that disposition, and you move from the Federal Election Commission to the IRS, or you've got the ability to put people in prison, or you've got the ability to do confiscatory fines, and all of a sudden, you see why people are so concerned about this. So where does this go? You know, it's clear that the administration is not going to be pursuing Lois Lerner. They're not going to pursue the contempt case that Congress has. Congress did a very unusual thing, did a criminal referral. I predict that goes nowhere with the current administration. But lest Lois relax completely, the statute of limitations doesn't lapse for Lois Lerner until about 9 months into a new administration. And my hunch is that a new administration is going to pull that file out and take a good, long, hard look at it.
Okay. All right. You got a lot of questions here, Peter, so we got to go quick. I know you're busy. Lauren Skolnick, Edelman, Chicago. Congressman Roskam, in your opinion, are renewable mandates like the Renewable Fuel Standard in conflict with free market principles?
Yeah, anytime you've got a federal mandate that tells people what they're going to do and how they've got to do it, there's a conflict there. So there's, we all tend to be free marketeers until our market gets burned a little bit. And then we tend not to be quite so defensive about the free market. I think what's going on a larger energy policy point of view is we've got to really sort this out. I would argue that it makes a lot more sense to let the market actually decide what the blends are that they want. There's a lot of folks that are environmentally sensitive that will pay a premium for different products. We are on the verge of an energy renaissance in this country that could absolutely be transformational, not just from an economic point of view, but from a foreign policy point of view. And we've got to sort out this right kind of balance. That is, how we can pursue energy that's reasonable and balanced and in such a way that guards against scarring our national resources. And I think we can do that.
Okay. Former Mayor Pete DiCiani of Elmhurst, now on the DuPage County Board, asks, Congressman, what is your take on Obamacare? Should it be repealed and a bipartisan bill passed instead, or will it be best to amend the existing? With 38 states faulting Obamacare, what is the next federal move? And of course, the Supreme Court's looking at it as well.
I think the next federal move is the King v. Burwell decision that I'm told has already been decided, but the justices are writing their opinion, and we expect this to happen in June. So, the justices, first of all, in terms of predictions, I have no credibility. I thought that the justices were going to come out on the other side of the first decision. So I am out of the business of predicting judges. That said, I think that you will see a lot of pressure on a Republican Congress to say, all right, you've been saying you don't like this, and you've been very clear in your criticism of it. Now, what's your alternative? And I think that what I'm in favor of is, I think, go back to where the country actually was when President Obama was first elected. We as a nation had made up our minds on two core issues. We made up our mind that health care was too expensive, by and large. And we also made up our mind that it really troubled us with the idea that somebody not having access to an insurance pool based on a pre-existing condition. So there are very thoughtful things that you can do to drive costs down, because there's things that are in healthcare, and the physicians and providers that are in here can give you memo after memo after memo about things that don't make anybody any healthier, but that they've got to do, that that just accelerate healthcare costs. You use that money and you can fund pre-existing condition pools, and I think you can do it in a far more elegant way than we have right now. So in answer to your question, the King v. Burwell decision is going to provoke action one way or another, and I think I represent a constituency that, as it relates to the healthcare law, looks at it and says, hey, swing and a miss. You know what I mean? Good effort, but let's start over on this thing.
Thank you. Randy Josts, member of the City Club, and who is with David Mason and Associates Engineers, asks, Congressman, how do we turn wasteful or fraudulent government practices, as you described in your remarks, into infrastructure, such as roads, transportation, bridges, infrastructure improvements that are badly needed to boost our economy?
Here's how. You create an expectation that money is fungible. Create just the understanding that money is fungible. So this notion that one element of the federal government can waste $1 billion a week, think of what Chairman Dillard could do with a portion of that money in terms of Metra and so forth. So there is this false choice that gets communicated a lot, and that is, well, that's over there and this is over here. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. The CMS guy, the Medicare guy, came in when we were talking about this, what's known as the doc fix, when we were in the process of dealing with this a couple of months ago. And I turned to him in this hearing and I said, you've got all the money. We're over here trying to grub around, trying to figure out how to come up with money to make sure that physicians and providers get paid. I said, you got all the money. Stop wasting $1 billion a week and think about what we can do. So the linkage is the transition, the beginning to think that it's not just gas tax and tollways and this, that, and the other thing on the revenue side. Let's stop wasting the money at the front end, and we can do a lot better.
Thank you, Congressman. Now, Todd Burlinghoff, Donna Pugh, and Karen Darch list their affiliation as business and municipalities. Will you support marketplace fairness if it is brought to the House for a vote? And can you describe what marketplace fairness is?
Marketplace fairness is an attempt by Hamilton Partners to frame this debate. No, I'm teasing. Marketplace fairness is that kind of the unfair nature that Main Street retailers are feeling, hey, we've got to charge sales tax when we're selling, but our competitors are coming online and those customers are not paying sales tax, and they don't mind competing apples to apples, but if it's a tax liability issue, they feel like they're behind the curve. So the issue is, how do you make sure that these are collectible and these are enforceable? And it all comes down to the details. You're being dragged into a subsequent, like, 3-month money month conversation that we've had with a number of folks on this. The bottom line is this issue needs to be remedied. The Marketplace Fairness Bill is a good step, but I'm not going to make a commitment to any particular bill until it actually gets on the floor and I see it. Fair enough?
Terrific, thank you. We've got a lot of questions here. We're going to try and move quickly. Dan, who claims to be a member of the City Club, asks, Dan, thank you for your membership. As treasurer, I'm going to check, all Dan. Over 25% of the 6th district is comprised of Latinos and Asians. George W. Bush got 44% of the Latino vote. Romney got 27%. Do you support immigration reform that includes a path to citizenship?
So I think what I've been very clear about is, if you want to get to the point where we get this immigration situation taken care of, you've got to break it down. And I am out of the all or nothing business. I don't think the federal government has the capacity to do comprehensive anything. I mean, anything. So the false claim of the Senate bill was, look, this is going to take care of it all one-stop shop, and it's completely ridiculous. You want to get to a yes and get this so you can actually get this problem solved? First of all, recognize there's some people that just want the issue because they can stoke people up. Then you've got some people that want to get to a remedy. If you want to get to a remedy, break it down. I've seen polling and focus groups where you can take a group of people that are absolutely hostile to doing anything on immigration, and you can move them to the point where about an hour's long discussion, you can get them to a point where they can get to yes on some of these things, but they have to be just sure that the border is secure. You cannot talk to them. They cannot hear anything that you say until the border is secure. Unless you think that there's some false claim like that this is a standard that can never be met. There are standards that can be met, and so this is not one of these things where you're always moving the goalposts. But once the border is secure, then you transition, and I would say, all right, let's figure out a guest worker program, work that through, then take a breath and say, all right, now let's deal with the high-skilled visas, all the IIT engineers that are getting PhDs, that we should have them move next door to me in Wheaton, starting businesses, but instead they can't get a green card, so they're going overseas competing against us. Once you get those stages done, then take a big breath, and this is a few years down the road, and say, all right, what do you want to do with 12 million people who are still here? Because I'll tell you this, the federal government is not going to have the power, nor are we going to give them the power to go out and get rid of people. Number two, there are 12 million customers that we need in this country. And so you see how you can change the disposition of a group of people, and you can actually get to yes on a solution. But based on the current configuration, the all or nothing stuff is you get nothing every time. And the proof is that we're no further along on this based on the all or nothing approach than we were 4 years ago.
I've got a great question here from Kim Godden of Superior Ambulance, a corporate constituent of Congressman's district. Do you feel that empowering MACs and RACs, which I'm sure means something to people in this business, to do audits is the best way to combat fraud and abuse? The concern among some is that MACs and RACs, M-A-C-S and R-A-C-S, each have their own standards and interpretations of Medicare rules and regulations and are thus incentivized necessarily to find fraud and abuse.
So this is an inside baseball question, but it gets to this larger point of how do you do it? How do you pursue waste and fraud in Medicare? One of the issues right now, if you're a healthcare provider, you feel like, look, these people come in, they're basically bounty hunters, they're incentivized, and we can't get a fair shake and a fair hearing. I think the smarter move is to move away from those and instead move more on the technology side so that you're catching the money before it goes out the door, like Visa does, as opposed to chasing it down later and trying to get it out of healthcare providers after it's been paid out.
And that relates to Charles Gardner of Roosevelt University and his question: how much of the $1 billion a week, Congressman, is actually recovered, as it should be, in the so-called Chase part of pay and chase?
I don't know, but not enough to impress me, and not enough where the guy was able to say, hey, I got good news here, Mr. Chairman. So I would assume it's a de minimis number.
Okay. Warren Ribley, president and CEO of IBIO, a member of the City Club, asks, what is the current status of repealing the medical device tax? What are the hurdles to enacting the repeal?
Medical device tax has that next year in Jerusalem feel to me. Hey, we're getting there. It's one of these things everybody's for, and it can't get passed. So the House of Representatives can pass this every day, all day long. Just tee it up, put it on the floor, and pass it out. And the Senate continues to be the United States Senate. Let me just put it that way.
It's not another Senate? Okay. Mark Weiermiller, a longtime member of the City Club, asks, what are the chances of Illinois being bailed out by the federal government now that the Illinois Supreme Court... Okay. Mark, is that okay for you? All right. Tom Bookie, member, says, how often does President Obama reach out to Congress? Your friend, your seatmate in the Illinois State Senate.
Listen, this is one of these answers where if I give you an honest answer, I sound petty. So let me just say this. We would welcome more interaction with President Obama at any level.
I have Valerie Jarrett's CTA email right in here. Unfortunately, she hasn't used it for 15 years. All right, Mrs. George Jane Johnson, member of the City Club. Congressman, as a longstanding statesman, do you believe Hillary Clinton is a good fit to be the next U.S. president? And please compare her to other candidates in the Republican Party.
There was a cover story of Time magazine written by a guy named David Von Drehle, who wrote a fantastic book on Abraham Lincoln called Rise to Greatness. But the Von Drehle cover story, you may have seen it a couple weeks ago, and it had this silhouette profile of Hillary Clinton, and the headline was this, essentially, I'm paraphrasing it: the Clintons write their own rules. Does America still want that? And I really question whether America wants that. You know, this notion of making a deal with yourself, with your emails. Like, oh, of course she deleted all these emails. Of course she's, submitting, huge gaps in time, because these are the Clintons and they just don't disappoint. So I think that the notion of her candidacy, I do not underestimate Hillary Clinton. I do not underestimate the Clintons and their operation. But it's a very interesting question, and this was what Time was getting at. Are they yesterday? Is that something that basically the country is tired of? And I think there's a strong argument to be made, and I think that it's not this whole idea that it's game, set, match, and that Hillary Clinton's the next president of the United States. This has that feel of where remember when the Patriots and the Giants, Patriots had a perfect season, but they had this one little game. It was called the Super Bowl. And I think that Hillary Clinton has that feel, and we'll just see what the Super Bowl brings.
All right. There may be questions about Hillary Clinton, but none about the City Club welcoming Peter Roskam.
Thank you, Chris.
Don't go. All right, step one, where's the fishbowl?